Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session where we're going to be talking about the future is regenerative. I'm Peter Murray. I'm Curator-in-Chief at New London Architecture. I'm moderating proceedings this afternoon. And achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is now enshrined in law, and many built and natural environmental professions have declared a commitment to achieve this. For the purposes of this discussion, we're looking at both construction and operational energy, and we're excluding offsetting as an option. The session will also highlight what all built environment professionals need as a working knowledge to deliver. Now, building life cycles will need to be longer than the 30 years or so often applied to commercial buildings and the 60, 70 years for housing. 80% of the buildings that we will have in 2050 already exist, and so retrofitting must be the preferred approach. Permission to demolish a building and rebuild should only be given if the proposer can show that the total GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, involved in the demolition of the existing building and the construction and use of the new building over the next 100 or so years are each and at most net zero. So where decisions become a bit more complicated is where there is pressure to build new housing, preferably on brownfield sites, and the efficacy of demolishing, say, low-rise factory buildings in favour of greater density housing developments. There is, of course, market pressure in terms of viability to build on poorly located brownfield sites, and poorly located greenfield ones as well, which lock residents into poorly located sites that create carbon-intensive modes of transport, regardless of whether the building itself is any energy efficient. So therefore, buildings and transport emissions need to be considered collectively, and it's vital that built environment professionals work together to address these impacts holistically. Building new and retrofitting existing buildings for the long term also puts a greater emphasis on other elements such as placemaking, as the communities will also need to be both self-sufficient and resilient. This will also put a focus on the role of planning, and you'll be hearing presentations about this in a moment. So in summary, we are required to rethink the commercial development and the housing industry, look at these things as a circular economy. So this session was actually developed together with The Edge and also the RTPI. And we've got a really great bunch of speakers for you this afternoon. And to kick off, we have Lynn Sullivan, OBE, who is a member of the Green Construction Board, chair of the Good Homes Alliance. And Lynn is a practicing architect, founding partner of Sustainable by Design. She was previously Sustainability Director at Broadway Mallion, Associate Director at ECD Architects, who pioneered an energy and environment conscious approach to design. She has advised successive UK governments on sustainability and energy efficiency in the built environment and chaired the expert panel for the Scottish Government. She is a member of the UK Government's Green Construction Board. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm also a member of The Edge, just to add that to the long list, hooray. Great to be here talking about net zero, but talking about net zero in 5 to 8 minutes. Yeah, we have got a way to go, and I guess the key thing, I was asked to talk about guidelines. I suppose our key guidelines are, first of all, get on with it, and second of all, we really need to understand better and start measuring the actual impact of what the built environment is on the planet's, the health of the planet. We're all kind of used, and have been used sort of for decades really, to the idea of measuring ecological resource and then seeing if we're net positive, which of course is now enshrined in law. Net gain in biodiversity, but are we really measuring net gain or in fact net reduction in our true impact in terms of the carbon emissions and energy used. So my first slide is referencing a project which I have carried out over the last 2 years on behalf of Green Construction Board, which was responding to the government's announcement to halve all energy use in new buildings by 2030. And I know, as Peter referenced in his intro, we are very much focused also on the retrofit agenda. But this work on the buildings mission showed us that actually there are some key approaches, if you like, which we must adopt going forward, which are about moving to an understanding of actual impact on energy use and impact on carbon emissions of our built environment. And the other thing is both measuring it and getting better with it in the future. So our starting point here was actually understanding where we're at now, which, if you're compliant with building regulations, doesn't necessarily tell you, because it automatically is talking about a sector of energy used in building, and it's only talking about the impact on carbon emissions. We need to understand both, because as the latest calculation methodology shows, actually the carbon impact of various different kinds of primary energy varies and will vary, and as we know is getting better in terms of renewables, but our starting point must be energy used at the meter. So in our project we analysed all the energy uses in our typical building stock for domestic buildings, office buildings and schools buildings. And then we sought to outline an approach to at least halve the demand of those buildings. Then we produced a whole load of case studies which show actually it's already been done and could be done now, is being done now in some cases, not driven by regulation, but being driven by clients who want buildings that actually perform as intended. And so, yes, you can halve demand. And what's interesting about this project is that we now have, over the last 2 years, we've had a whole convergence of really, really useful information from various sources, which are a few of which I'll reference now, which show that actually this methodology is the way forward. So this is what we need for our transition. So our starting point on the left-hand side of the slide was understanding our benchmark. What's the typical energy used at the meter of all these building types? That is for all energy used in buildings. And can we halve it? And yes, we can. That has now been translated into the RIBA's 2030 targets, which, if you're not familiar with, I do recommend you have a look at. So actually, for example, in domestic buildings here, we've started with a benchmark of 140, I think 146 kilowatt hours per square meter. Halving it, we looked for all our case studies at least as good as 70 kilowatt hours per square meter. And that the RIBA have enshrined in the 2030 targets as the target for 2025, which is perfectly doable. So this is actually reducing energy demand through good fabric, good services, low carbon services preferably. And then we look for the fixes that we get from energy storage, renewable energy supply, decarbonised grid, you name it. And the wonderful work from Letty, who, if you're not familiar with their most recent net zero design report, also reflects this target and makes it even more. So 2030, their target is halving it again. So in other words, roughly a quarter of what we now use in this sector, and it's the same for the other sectors, we should be aiming to get down to that. So really, really reduce the demand and then think about all the other stuff. And as it happens, I think that's just highlighting the kilowatt hours targets. The UK Green Building Council, I think a couple of weeks ago, set out their targets, the net zero pathway, if you like, for office buildings. And this takes a very similar trajectory. And very interestingly, I suggest you get hold of this, but it's very simply set out. What do we expect in terms of a renewable energy contribution? And if it's only that much, which is about a quarter of what we need, then actually what do we have to do to demand? We have to bring it right down. So the same approach is reflected in this, and I think probably John later on will talk about this, because this also reflects a scheme which is being rolled out in Australia called Neighbours, which tackles this same pathway. But of course, there are some elephants in the room. If we really want to be net positive on our built environment, we have to start measuring all energy incurred in the building process, and that involves selecting materials. So whole life carbon is absolutely key. And also we have to think about our existing building stock, last but not least. So I'm currently involved in both a mission report on the retrofit pathway, and also working with Letty and others on what we need to do about embodied carbon, because we have to take a whole life approach. And actually the key on retrofit is we must use our existing buildings wherever we possibly can. But the same principles apply. Understand where all the energy takes are in your existing building stock, and try and develop, if you like, Paris-proof targets. So we're not going to get big wind and decarbonised electricity, tomorrow. We've got to do something in the next 10 years about our existing building stock. We're trying to categorise our existing building stock and think about archetypal, if you like, pathways for energy demand reduction, and then our expectations in terms of renewable energy supply and demand management, resource management in terms of energy supply. So this is work ongoing. I think government's prepared to put money into this, but nobody's very clear how to do it. So we need to be pushing for this same approach to be applied to retrofit, and then we can actually make a national plan. But it's not about going from EPCE to EPCC. It's actually understanding all energy uses in building and getting on with it. And on embodied carbon, sorry, have I overrun, Peter? Just about there. Okay, great. So embodied carbon is a huge topic, but yes, it's about the whole life of the materials we're using. It's actually thinking about energy use in processes, in fabrication, that is of the components and materials, and then it's thinking about the whole life in a building and its deconstruction at the end. So that includes all the maintenance cycles, everything. And work is ongoing through GLA, UK Green Building Council and others, but we still don't have a really agreed methodology. But what we do have is a rapid increase in actual declarations from manufacturers on energy performance declarations in terms of products, which is a huge benefit in setting out a pathway. So yeah, it's a big subject. I can't possibly cover it all in 5 minutes, but I'm encouraging people to think about the end game. If we really want to get net zero, we have to think about all emissions. We have to think about verifying what actually happens. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Our next speaker is Duncan Baker-Brown. He's currently teaching and researching issues around sustainable architecture for half of his week. He's doing that at the Faculty of the Arts at University of Brighton. He has completed the Brighton Waste House in partnership with students from City College at Brighton and Hove, and there are some photographs of it just on the BBM stand just over there. Excellent project. To date, over 400 students have helped with the design and build of the house. Duncan is also in practice with Ian Mackay, and they work together at BBM. Duncan.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, I've got quite a few slides. I might not get through all of them. I'm also the author of a book called The Reuse Atlas, which is subtitled A Designer's Guide to a Circular Economy. And I'm just wanting to point out what everybody knows, but we are in very different times. This time last year, there were no declarations of a climate emergency. And now 75% of the population of the UK live in local authority regions that have declared, and they've not only declared, they've then said that what they're going to do about it, which is to be net carbon zero in only a decade. So we are in a totally different environment. And why should we care? Well, I care because of this sort of stuff and always have done. This is part of our supply chain. This is a protected bit of rainforest. I could have shown you something burning instead. I nicked this from Vivienne Westwood. It's a pretty crude map, but it shows what happens if we don't do anything about it. The red stuff is uninhabitable, and you can see with Australia, you can believe that. So why us? Well, the construction industry creates 60% of our annual waste, i.e. 120 million tons. Annually, we consume 600 million tons and throw 200 million tons of that away. 60% of that is part of the construction industry. So what next? There's a bit of that. There's a lot of that. That cartoon is 25 years old. My partner Ian Mackay drew that when we were working on the Greenwich Millennium Village. And now we're doing a bit of this. So humankind needs to learn how to manage planet Earth's resources. And so it's all about managing resources, not just carbon, stuff, people, water, food, everything. And my point of view is it's designers and architects and constructors that do that. We are the managers of resources. Now, we've got a lot of challenges, not least the fact that at the moment we're a completely linear economy where we take stuff, we make it into something and throw it away between 2 minutes and 200 years later. So we've got to drastically reduce our reliance on raw materials, and that is what we've got to do, bottom line, and we've got to start doing it now. And we're not very good at it. That's a photograph of the last 23 North American bison in 1913. After that photograph was taken, another 10 were shot. We don't know when to stop. Nasty, scary things about emissions, but there are opportunities. And I think a circular economy and closed-loop systems is a very clear way of behaving in the future, right now, actually. And in a circular economy, you have a biosphere, which is the organic stuff, and then you have the inorganic stuff, like my Fairphone here, which is designed to be deconstructed and reconstructed again and again and again. At the moment, BMW would tell you that 80% of their BMWs are recyclable, but not into BMWs. In a circular economy, old BMWs are food stock for new BMWs. Some good news. We've nearly halved the amount of waste we've created in the construction industry in the last 10 years. And RAP estimates that 20% of the construction industry is already circular. And there's a decline in the consumption of coal. And that's a very nice graph with a dip. Let's hope it carries on like that. And everyone's talking about it. This is a recent article in The Guardian, in the AJ, and we're even refusing these things now. These are different times. So perhaps you may refuse a project before you reduce the amount of materials you use on a project, before you start reusing, before you recycle, in that order. And there's hope. And I can't read it from here. But basically what I'm saying is cities are our hope, because city-states are the ones in the UK and around the world that have declared a climate and ecological emergency. Okay, Parliament has, and government's thinking about it. But our city-states are demanding the net zero carbon targets that we need. And they're up there in terms of ambition, and building controls down there, and there's not a lot in between. So it's our city-states that are going to make it happen. At the moment, I'm helping Brighton Hove City Council draft a circular economy route map. And they've said out loud it's for their construction and tourist sectors that it's going to be their #1 priority. They're already letting contracts that are using the language of the circular economy. So cities are material stores for the future. And we can think of ourselves as urban miners, reusing the stuff that's already been made. There are people doing it already. These guys, they collect the world's supply of damaged fire hoses. They make some of them into luxury goods. They sell the others. They're doing it with 15 other sources of material. Interface have been doing it for years. This year, all their source material for plastic carpet will be old plastic carpet and fishing nets. I did it with the Brighton Waste House in 2014. 90% of the Brighton Waste House was thrown away by someone. That's what 25,000 toothbrushes look like. The Brighton Waste House isn't a model for how to build. It's a sort of flask of containing dumb design ideas, like these 25,000 toothbrushes that were never used. Fossil fuels processed into plastic, processed into toothbrushes, put on a jetliner, sent across the Atlantic, cleaned up, and sent to landfill incineration. That's what they're designed for. And we got most plastic that's ever been produced is still with us. And we collected it, and we made the waste house out of it. And we're carrying on with live projects, because it's not a house, it's a teaching facility at the University of Brighton. And now we collected duvets, because nobody reuses or recycles duvets, and it actually works very well as insulation. And we also found, this is us testing it actually, we also found other waste streams local to the waste house in Brighton. 50,000 oyster shells a year are thrown away by one restaurant. We've turned them into tiles, external wall tiles. These guys in Denmark are called the Lendeker Group. Now, famously, everybody knows that 20th century brickwork is not reusable because the mortar is stronger than the bricks themselves. 19th century's got lime-based mortar, very sensible, you can reuse the bricks. But the Lendeker Group got to 3 or 4 different buildings from the 1960s with an angle grinder and redistributed. So that's reuse instead of recycling. And these guys are really doing it. They've gone from architects, artists, academics, to being completely focused on deconstructing buildings that normally get demolished. So this is urban mining at its best. And you read these slides from top left to bottom right. Rotor deconstruction. They're currently deconstructing a World Trade Center in Brussels, which is on this sort of what Peter referred to, the 20 or 30-year cycle. So these are buildings that have not been designed to be material stores for the future. And we're doing one of these projects with Rotor in the summer. So we're hosting a summer school. And next week I'm writing a brief for demolition companies to slow the brief down into deconstruction. So we've got a building being given to us by the city. It will be deconstructed, and the material from that site will be source material for our summer school, where we'll get students working with it. This is a real example of building deconstruction, making money. So Cleveland Steel found a building in Dublin. It had a BIM model. They deconstructed it and reconstructed it in the UK. And that's including things not being quite right with the BIM model. A bit of welding, a bit of stuff had to happen. Bit of faffing around. They saved £1 million on a £6 million building by deconstructing an existing building. So we need to be creative with our retrofitting. It's more than just external wall insulation and solar panels. This is my favorite project. This is L'Aquitaine and Versailles in Paris. The existing building there on the left, due for demolition. The mayor of Paris had put aside the funding to demolish the tower and build a new one. It's sheltered housing. There's the existing one on the, as it is now on the right. L'Aquitaine and Versailles went to the mayor and said, we can give you your new scheme for 2/3 the price. Now this is how they did it. They just removed the external concrete cladding panels. They kept the community within the tower, and then they bolted on these winter gardens, which is an extension for the apartments, by the way, and 2 layers of sliding double-glazed units and a balcony. And that's it going up there on the left. So communities aren't displaced, and well-being is heightened. Utility bills are lowered. This is creative designer. This is a scheme. I don't know how long have I got? Just a bit over. I'll finish with this. This is a scheme in Norway, which is the Oslo Urban Mountain. Now, what's interesting here is an existing tower that's going to be extended and overhauled. The point is the design team are saying that they're going to reprocess 80% of the waste coming off the tower for the new project. So it's understanding the supply chain. I'm working with Bellestock in Paris at the moment, who are deconstructing the Montparnasse Tower, not to demolish it and take it away, but the 40-year-old facade and the internal fittings are being carefully deconstructed, not thrown away. This work is happening. And I want to end on that. So when I wrote my book, I came up with this idea that we should mine the Anthropocene, rework the current human-made geological layer on planet Earth, and nurture the natural world, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to give the natural world half a chance. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan. Our next speaker is Emma Davies. She works as a Principal Sustainability Consultant within the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service. Her work includes the development of new planning policy related to climate change and sustainable design, as well as construction and the provision of advice, information and training. Current projects include development of new planning policies in relation to sustainable design and construction, net zero carbon and adaptation as part of the development of the Greater Cambridge Local Plan. Emma.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about what is the role of planning in responding to the climate emergency and the ecological emergencies that we have. And this is a slide that I like to start with. It's an image from the Committee on Climate Change. And it's basically showing the role of societal and behavioural change in getting us to net zero carbon. So to get to net zero, the grey part of this slide is the bit that really interests me. This is the bit of the slide and the pie chart that shows the measures that we need that are a combination of low carbon technology and societal and behavioural change. And this, for me, is where I think planning has a significant role to play in responding to the climate emergency. What is planning about? It's become a bit of a dirty word in recent years. But planning is about placemaking. It is about shaping places so that people are more easily able to make the transition to a net zero carbon society. But we know, if the slide will change, there we go, we know that over recent years, planning hasn't really fulfilled its role in responding to our changing climate. There's been numerous studies that show that planning is failing in its response to climate change. There's a whole host of reasons for this, but for me, personally, I think one of the big issues that we have is that in recent years, national rhetoric is fixated on housing numbers and housing delivery, and delivering a 5-year housing land supply. It even has got to a point where we've seen changes in permitted development rights that are leading, as Peter referred to earlier, to the conversion of buildings that are wholly unsuitable for residential development to housing, that are leaving people completely socially isolated, away from any sense of community, and in locations that do not support the transition to zero carbon lifestyles. We are losing the bigger picture. The fundamental purpose of planning is all about place. It's not just about buildings, it's about place. And for me, if we are to ensure that planning plays its full role in responding to the climate emergency, we need to get back to those fundamentals. Now, of course, there's a lot that we can do with buildings, as is illustrated on this slide. I will apologise, I am not an architect. This is what happens when you give a planner some colouring pens. We get a little bit carried away. But there is a lot that we can do with buildings. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the Future Homes Standard and Part L, which is all focused on building regulations. But I would argue there is an incredibly strong role for planning in improving the performance of our buildings. It is only planning that can take account of local viability and push standards further. And we've already seen local planning authorities doing this. We've seen this happen in London. We're seeing it happening in Reading. I would also argue that it is only planning that can truly promote a design-led approach to reducing the carbon emissions associated with new buildings. This is a fundamental aspect of building design, and it involves all built environment disciplines. It should not just be left to M&E consultants and building regulations. I apologise to all building consultants in the room, but I think we need to work collaboratively to fix this problem. But I would also argue that we need to be looking at the bigger picture. Oh, get to the bigger picture. Here we go. So I would argue we need to move away from numbers. We need to stop designing around cars, which is what is in the bottom image here. We have to move away from designing around cars. And we need to change the narrative of planning. Planning is not the enemy of enterprise. Planning is about designing places to enable societal change in the face of the climate and ecological emergency. So yes, it is about designing and constructing buildings that are net zero carbon, both in their operation and also how they are constructed. But as the top image shows, it's about much more than that. It's about the spaces between buildings. It's how those spaces enhance the health and well-being of society, and also how they enhance the adaptive capacity of our communities. You know, we have a climate emergency. We've seen in recent weeks the effect that flooding is having on communities, and that is only going to get worse. It's also about where we locate development. It's about the form that that development takes, and it's about designing places where people can safely and easily travel around by walking or using bicycles or by using public transport. The default option cannot be jumping in the car anymore. We also need to think about how we can redesign our existing communities to help deliver a switch to lower carbon lifestyles. So we need to repurpose existing infrastructure rather than building new infrastructure. And we need to promote the adaptive reuse of buildings before we start thinking about building new. And it's also thinking about the ways in which new development can enhance existing communities. So perhaps thinking about whether there is a role for new development in helping to support the retrofit of existing communities. These are not radical ideas. This is what planning is all about. This is proper, inclusive placemaking that delivers benefits for society as a whole. And the sooner we get back to that and move away from just thinking about numbers and jobs, the better. Thank you. Very quick.
Thank you very much. Now, our next speaker is Fiona Scott. Fiona co-founded Gort Scott Architects in 2007 with Jay Gort. She recently completed a piece of guidance for the Mayor of London called High Streets and Town Centres, Adaptive Strategies. And Gort Scott also works on projects involving existing heritage buildings, such as universities and town halls, looking at how existing assets can be optimised for contemporary ways of learning and working. And Fiona is currently one of the Mayor's design advocates. Fiona.
Thank you, Peter. So I think we're finding ourselves in practice in a place where we're seeing global challenges meeting local and really hyper-local concerns. And we're finding that they're often in conflict. So we've got conflict between the things that we want and need to do to use less carbon-intensive materials and processes and proposed changes in the regulatory landscape, like building regulations, Part L and fire regs. And those proposed changes aren't necessarily supporting what we need to be doing. Also, we've got the climate crisis meeting the politics of austerity, and it's limiting the public sector's ability to plan and implement the kind of scale of changes that that Emma's referring to. And then, of course, you've got Brexit that's potentially going to be limiting our ability to raise quality and raise standards. So I'm finding that we are having to work much, much harder, as we should, I guess, but be very agile as practitioners and as leaders of our businesses to make sure that we have the expertise to fulfill our responsibilities to our clients, but also to the future. So I wanted to just cover this in the very short time I've got to on a project that's involving urban strategy and on one that's involving a sort of medium-sized building. So we have just launched a document called High Streets and Town Centres, Adaptive Strategies, and this is for the Mayor of London, so it is very much the London context. So in London, high streets are very resilient. This is largely because they're so diverse. Our research shows that high street businesses are growing considerably and have done in the last 5 years, and more so than other businesses. So we don't sort of buy the dystopian idea of everybody sort of giving into Uber Eats and internet shopping. The point is that high streets have so much more to do than service consumer needs, but they will also have to obviously service consumer needs in a less carbon-intensive way. So the research looks at the case for investing in high streets. They are incredibly effective spatial catchments in which we can deal on a very local level with wider societal issues. So we look at the challenges, including changes in how people want to spend their money, changes in how people experience cities, in the way that people work and live, and changes in technology and changes in governance structures, and of course climate change. And if we're going to stay within the 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which it's looking increasingly likely that we won't, there is a huge amount that we need to do to change the way that our cities function. So we did 10 case studies to kind of propositions to sort of look at this, but barely have a time to look at one, which is a case study in the West End. And this is about how we upgrade and adapt existing buildings. And obviously that is so important for both the identity of a place, but also for accommodating speculative change or experimentation and prototyping, the things that you might not necessarily be able to build a business case for in the case of a new building. And these are obviously the things that keep high streets vital and support the codependency of all the different kinds of uses that make high streets work, whether that's uses in buildings or in the spaces around buildings. And so this proposition looks at policy, at licensing, at landlord controls to help facilitate that. And this research was done as a whole to help local authorities and private partners build really ambitious, mission-orientated scenarios to understand the future possibilities for our high streets, and to really define the change that we need to see. So then moving to a modest building on a high street in a town centre, and this starts with a complex story about why and when buildings are retained or demolished. This is an extraordinary, odd, delightful, idiosyncratic, lovely, mixed-use town centre building, and it's built by a local authority in the 1950s. And one of the issues that we have as architects is that often there's a presumption made long before we're involved, when perhaps you've got project managers or commercial advisors that have been asked quite narrow questions by the client, advising clients that it is less risky to build new, or that there's a chance for additional scale if you're going to start from scratch. We obviously know, and it's been mentioned before, but the most significant thing that you can do to reduce carbon impact is to keep the existing fabric. And this again is mentioning again the LETI guidance that was recently launched, and it's, I can't recommend it enough. It's incredibly encouraging that this document has been produced, that it's so thorough and so informative, and it's received such a good reception. But in this case, we were asked to refurbish this very lovely building, but as a temporary use, as a meanwhile project, whilst the council was planning to demolish it in a couple of years' time. And that's not, the council, that is the commercial advice that they were given. So this is the existing building. You've got obscured windows, you've got a nice lowered ceiling. And we stripped it back and revealed a much taller ceiling height, the light flooding in, the views to the high street, and a very robust existing concrete structure. And then refurbished it to incorporate new retail startup spaces. There's workspaces. There's a bakery that does design workshops and food workshops. There's recording studios. And it's a very well-used and much appreciated building. But shortly after that meanwhile use was opened, the building was Grade 2 listed, and which was really great news. And subsequently, it won't be knocked down, but instead we're designing a small building that sits at the rear where there's currently garages and kind of waste dumping, to be honest. It's a pretty unprepossessing hinterland. And the building that we're proposing is a little building with commercial units at ground floor and flats above, and it nestles in the L shape of that existing building, and it creates a little muse in between the two buildings, and all of that great stuff that happens on the ground floor of the existing building can make use of that public or semi-public space in the town centre. But I think it's important to say that it was enforced by a heritage designation, and there are lots of reasons that buildings aren't retained to do with decisions based on cost and on risk at very early stages. And I think in my experience as well, there's very rarely a willingness for an imaginative appraisal of the potential additional value that can be created by retaining the existing building. And of course, the cost as assessed often doesn't reflect the true cost or the environmental cost, and then there's VAT on top of that. So retaining the existing building is absolutely the right thing to do, and I think it's going to be a great project. It makes for a more diverse and more characterful and more vital bits of cities, not just because of the fabric, not just because of the design of the existing buildings, but also because of the way that they can be used. So, I think that the retention in this case really locks in existing value, and not just commercial value, but the whole spectrum of different kinds of value. I don't think that it would have been possible to design a new semi-public muse space in a town centre in a wholly new, starting from scratch development. So I know I'm running over now, but I wanted to end with this, which seems like a bit of a swerver, but it's actually to me very connected. And on the 1st of January, we launched the Charter of the London Practice Forum, and this is a group of 21 practices that come together to help us navigate, a very difficult landscape around how we create social value, how we create environmental value, around technical issues, insurance issues, and answer really difficult questions in a collegiate way. And it's another example that completely convinces me that as an industry we can make a difference, but also that it's collectivism and collaboration that is the way forward for us to square up to our biggest challenges.
Thank you, Fiona. And now our final speaker in this session is John Davies. He's head of sustainability at Derwent London. Derwent London have been champions of retrofit since the mid-1980s, and John is responsible for leading the company-wide sustainability and responsibility agendas. And prior to joining Derwent London, John was head of sustainability at Davis Langdon. John, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. Now for something, I won't say completely different, but slightly different. So we've heard sort of the thin end of the wedge in terms of design, sort of the planning perspective, and some of the sort of the moral imperative in terms of where we are today. And it's worth just touching on that very, very briefly. That actually, what I'll do, a quick straw poll. Who on the floor actually works in sustainability in a company or environmental matters on the company? So the following slides you guys you can hopefully latch onto in terms of sitting in the camp of what I call Camp GSD, which is Camp Get Stuff Done. You can swap out the S every now and again depending on how vexed you get. Just out of interest, who on the floor is sort of, I suppose, a member of the general public who's just here today to have a bit of a look round and look at the materials and bits and pieces? Okay, there's going to be one or two things in the presentation which might not necessarily chime directly with you, but I'll endeavour to explain what they mean to help with the contexting of what we're going to go through. Let me move through. No. There we go. Very, very briefly, just in case you don't know who we are, as Peter sort of said, we've been around for a wee while as a business. We are what's known as a real estate investment trust, or a REIT, and we own approximately about 5 million square feet, or just over 5.5 million square feet in London, about £5.4 billion worth. All dotted around, very conveniently around zones 1, 2 in London, and retrofitting, or very much a design-led retrofitting approach has been very much something that we've been keen on as a business for a very, very long time. So I'll touch on that very briefly towards the end of the presentation. Well, what I wanted to touch on first was some of the drivers for net zero. We've seen in some of the other presentations the sort of the broader context. We've seen some of the issues around climate events. We've seen a lot of things around the Extinction Rebellion, the Greta effect, however you want to measure or monitor that. But for businesses like ourselves, not only do we see that out on the ground every day, but we also see some other things that perhaps members of the public don't see day to day. And those that do work in sustainability or environmental matters in industry, in business, in design, whatever, some of these things you might start to recognise or know or intimately work with day in, day out. But they come from a number of different angles. So the top left there, we've got this thing called TCFD. I won't go into the gory detail about that because it is quite a long and lengthy process. But essentially, you can market that or badge that as that's the financial world wanting to get under the skin of climate-related issues, in this case, climate-related disclosures around how your business and how your effectively your money is related to and has the effect on climate change. Top right-hand side, effectively, this is UK PLC. This is the UK trying to work out from the bottom up how we deal with the issues that are associated with climate change and the climate assembly, which for many of their wrongs, the government has do many rights, and I think this is a fantastic forum, actually getting people to come up with some of these solutions on the floor as to actually how they can tackle these issues on a local basis. Bottom right-hand side, GRESB, or the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. This is a very property-centric, development-centric thing. Effectively, this is where investor analysts are the people that look at us day to day and decide whether we're a noteworthy investment for their pension funds or on their investments. They ask loads of questions on this. So how are we responding to climate change? What does our carbon footprint look like? How are we reducing that? What does your energy consumption look like? How are you reducing that? Tell me, tell me, tell me. So we're constantly providing information and data. Flip that over to the left-hand side, there we see the Science Based Targets Initiative, linked into a much broader pattern about how you're going to measure and how you're going to reduce, and how collectively people can view your progress. So are you setting a carbon target that's linked to some kind of climate scenario, whatever that may be? And then slap bang in the middle, we have the Better Buildings Partnership, not necessarily related to any of those, but it's just picking up on a point that Lynn made with regards to the Neighbours scheme and bringing neighbours over here into the UK through a scheme called Design for Performance. So ourselves and 8 other property firms here in the UK are funding the development of a UK-based neighbours scheme, which the idea is very, very simply, it's a RON seal sticker for a building that says the building is going to operate at this level of energy consumption, or indeed you can proxy that to carbon. So we're going to be giving people, or trying to give people, an accurate representation of what the building is going to do, and likewise help them make an informed decision about whether they want to take space in that building or not. Very different to an EPC, which will tell you a completely different number, which, if anyone in the room knows how EPCs work, well then you'll know exactly the distance between real life and what that EPC tells you. So that's just sort of some of the drivers as organisations like us see it. But the next bit I wanted to sort of touch on is when you sit in that camp, that dear old camp GSD, you are effectively trying to balance a set of conflicting priorities. And when I say conflicting priorities in this sense, not everything is as clear as we'd like to think it is. And likewise, some demands pull greater than others, which pull you in a slightly different direction, and ultimately affects how you reach your endpoint, in this case, net zero carbon. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at things like, traditionally, as we've spoken about, operational carbon. So how much electricity, or indeed gas, if I dare use that word, gets consumed in your building, your property, your home, whatever that might be. On the right-hand side, embodied carbon, so effectively the amount of carbon it's taken, or the GHG emissions it's taken to create your thing, your product, whatever that might be. And as we've spoken about, It can appear to be the elephant in the room, but it's actually, as we also said, it's a critical component of the net zero thing, whatever that might be. It means different things to different people. For us as a real estate business and as a landlord, occupier requirements. So what do the customers want? What are they asking for? Do they know what they want? Do they know exactly what net zero means? Do we have to communicate it to them? Or do they have to communicate it, God forbid, to us? Hopefully they don't. But it's a key factor for us. And again, the presentation that Fiona was taking us through sort of highlights this range of opinion and the range of understanding with regards to, do you keep a building or do you not keep a building? What's the rationale? Is it a commercial one? Does that commercial one stack up? How does it fare against the carbon appraisal, for example? Again, another important aspect is that investor requirement. Companies like us and many other companies rely on people giving their money to us in order for us to do what we do, to return a return to them accordingly. So how do we build that into what we do day to day to deliver not only a net zero result, but a net positive result to them in terms of the financial return? Again, not an easy equation to balance, and sometimes the two are very much conflicting when you're presenting a business case. And then likewise, that links into investment appetite. So what's the pain threshold for investors into this marketplace? How much are they willing to spend extra over? Is it an extra over cost, or have we already factored it in and we're just not telling people that we've factored it in? Question mark. And the last part, and I know Peter mentioned at the top of the show that offsetting was not something that we were considering, but it is a word that we will have to deal with in some way, shape or form at the start of this journey in order to realise at the end of the journey that we shouldn't need it. So almost as a little bit of a voyage of discovery with regards to offsetting or insetting or off-netting, depending on which way you want to look at it. So again, it's something to bear in mind in the back of our heads. And as a tail end Charlie in all of this, sometimes dealing with this makes you feel like that, whether it's President Bush there holding the baby or the baby crying. Either way, sometimes it can get to you like this in terms of just trying to make how you deal with this thing and how you actually bring this thing to a sense of order. And as we've touched on, and as many people may or may not say, the best building or the best sustainable building is one you never knock down. And there's a huge amount of sense in all of that. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out if you're leaving something intact, then surely it must be better from a carbon perspective. But there's also a couple of lessons in terms of operational carbon to learn in amongst that although the big prize might be embodied carbon, there is an operational carbon element that needs squaring as part of that process when you are looking to uprate a building. So not always as truly virtuous as we might think it could be all of the time. So up to time now, almost done. As I said, is this a new movement? We predict certainly that a lot more organisations like ourselves will be looking at this retro movement a lot more seriously than they have been previously. And the cost differentials are now beginning to shine through in terms of if you keep something in place, it's a cheaper and it can often be a more efficient process, but not always, and it does depend on what you're looking at. But one example we have here, unfortunately we've solved this now, one of my favourite buildings in the stock now, no longer with us, it's the Buckley building up on Clerkenwell Green, excellent Pinson Mason's office when we inherited it back in the mid 2000s, and repositioned the building, removed some of the 1980s adornments on the front, repositioned the property internally, and it was one of our most successful schemes on a profit on cost basis. So for us as a business, this sort of thing makes utter financial sense and it makes utter sustainability sense. Hopefully, for some of the organisations out there that aren't necessarily looking at it in this way, take that creative leap, I think, and you'll certainly start to reap some of the benefits. And that's me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Now we've got a bit of time for some questions, but so if you get your questions ready, I've just got a few questions I'd like to ask our speakers before going out to the floor. Perhaps, Lynn, I could start with you. I mean, you're an advisor to government. Do you think this government have got it. I believe you're going to be judge of some new competition for sustainable home design competition. So do you think they're really understanding some of the issues we've been talking about?
I hope so. I think there's a big gap at the moment in terms of the high-level aspiration, which is being repeated and certainly was yesterday at the launch of the Home of 2030 competition by the new housing minister. We need homes that, take us on the road to net zero, that meet, lots of other needs in society. But at the same time, the Part L consultation is telling us that, local authorities should not be allowed to set their own aspirational targets. So I think the large print giveth and the small print taketh away at the moment. So I'm kind of waiting with bated breath, really.
Thank you very much. Well, and Duncan, it was some time ago that the president of the RIBA talked about long life, loose fit, low energy, and that really is a key part of the circular economy. I guess if you're going to be building new buildings, they should be flexible and be able to be changed and demountable.
No, of course. And I just think that they've also got to be designed to be deconstructed. I've heard people even recently say, well, if you make them more durable, then, or if it's good design, high quality design, they won't be demolished. That is really naive. You never know why a building's going to be demolished. So just make sure you design it to be deconstructed, and then it's a material resource. And I think two things are happening at the moment. People are getting a better understanding of that, but also within the industry, we do have the skills to deconstruct buildings that we thought we couldn't.
Yeah. Thank you. And Emma, it gets a lot of criticism, but could be seen as a move towards retrofit, and that's PD on reusing office space for homes, but the quality of those isn't that great, but it is retrofit. How do you get the right balance as a planner on that?
That's a very interesting question. I think we need to have a mechanism in place, even if it is permitted development, to enable us to properly scrutinise the plans that are coming forward, to make sure that they are fit for purpose. And at the moment, that is missing. We're not getting to look at any plans. They just go through prior approval with very limited information. So I think there needs to be some amendments so that we can ask for greater levels of detail, maybe ask for kind of carbon assessments or something as part of those schemes, so we can at least have some input into their development.
Thanks. And Fiona, Emma talked about we have to design cities so they're not for the car, but for other ways of getting around. But your experience of high streets, is the shape of London changing in that there are more mixed-use developments where people can, might say, live, work and play in a more polycentric city, or are we still a sort of zone one city where everything really happens in the middle?
Well, we're a growing city, so I think there's still lots of stuff happening in the city. In the middle, there's still people commuting, and public transport in London is extraordinary. So that does very well. But London's growing, and outer London is bearing a lot of the burden of that growth, or burden, reward even. So outer London is changing hugely, and we're seeing potential clients, but also local authorities planning for. Thinking about their high streets not just as shopping streets, but as places for new kinds of work and for attracting new businesses to start up. And obviously that isn't a new idea. I think it's just taken a while to kind of remember that that's what they've always been about. I think there was a kind of, the past 20 or 30 years where high streets were trying to compete with shopping centres, and that was the key narrative. And now, there's a recognition that what makes a good high street is only shops and cafes are important to its vitality, but they are not. You need all the other stuff to generate the footfall. You need the workspace. You need the experience of the place.
Thank you. And finally, John. How do you balance value? I mean, you talked about investors, the pressures investors have, and in a growing city, changing city where increased densification is happening, suddenly values of land change as you have the capacity to build taller on sites which maybe that wouldn't have been acceptable. How do you balance the issues we've been talking about with the values that you can get from higher density development?
Yeah, I suppose it's there. Yeah, do you pilot high, sell them cheap, or is it volume or not? It's very much balanced on the value equation. About the quality of your design always shines through, and it's the same in anything. And ultimately, that's what we find with a lot of our occupiers and a lot of our potential occupiers, that when they do the round robin around the market, when they've got their space, looking at their space requirements, it's very, very clear to see which ones they focus on, and it is ultimately the quality designs always shine through. And what you get by virtue of having those that level of detail, and it's not necessarily just sort of fussy architectural design or grand gestures. These are considered things which people can ultimately tie back to, does it work for my workforce, my most expensive asset? If it does, brilliant, tick. Will it give me my inherent sustainability requirements I have as a company? If it does, brilliant, tick. Once you start building all of those in, the value proposition just starts to build, starts to increase, and that is where you ultimately strike on better quality deals and better quality covenants.
And how would you score something like the White Collar Factory? Because that was set out to be a new style of building, wasn't it? I mean,
yeah.
Does it match up to the standards we were looking at like today? Because things are changing very fast in terms of
very much so. And I think
perceptions.
it was designed, and I think we talked a little bit about this idea about it should always be designed for deconstruction, but before that, it should be designed for flexibility. Ultimately, commercial offices need to have a second, third, fourth nature about them. So if you look at White Collar Factory in terms of the kit specification for the building is actually exceptionally mean. There isn't much moving parts in it. The more moving parts you can take out, the less complicated the building becomes to run, the less complicated it becomes to look after. But also when it comes to repurposing, the less complicated and less wasteful when you're taking things out. And the concept of long life, loose fit was actually coined at that building in terms of the idea of it was actually centered around the idea of the concept of dilapidations and trying to reduce that, if not eliminate that process of dilapidation, of moving in and moving out. Effectively people taking kit and items out and throwing it in the bin and putting their own kit in. The idea is they can take it out, there's a blank canvas, and it can move straight in and a lot easier. And whether that's a creative industry outfit, whether that is a financial services outfit, a television company, a restaurant, or whatever it can be, the idea is that people can effectively make it what they want and hopefully have many, many lives in its iteration before, God forbid, we get to the stage where it's no longer required in its present current physical form.
Thanks very much. I don't want to be picky, but actually Simon Orford pinched Long Life Loose Fit from Alex Gordon, who was the president of the RABA in 1972, when the RABA was really right ahead of everybody else in terms of energy management. They even handed out, I'm sure Robin Nicholson has probably got one, little pocket computers that architects could use to determine the energy consumption of their buildings. So I think, anyway, so the RABA, that statement, I think, really one of the most important things the RABA said for a long time. But anyway, yes, let's have some questions. We have a hand right over there, and Robin, I'll come to you in a moment. So.
The acoustics.
Hi.
The
words mentioned have been whole life cycle analysis, circular economy. I'd just like to reflect on that because my roots are from India and Africa. And to me, the words whole life cycle should be cradle to cradle, like the German authors mentioned. But when I've spoken to a lot of people, they say that these products, whether it's a wind turbine or your phone, the cost of that is actually calculated in terms of the shareholder price. Shareholder price is calculating the price of the product at the point of the purchase, but it's not calculating the price of the product at the point of extraction. And one thing that seems to be blemished over a lot, which is a major anomaly, is the fact that wind turbines, solar panels, the concrete, where the hell does all these materials come from? It's mined in slave pits in Africa and India. And the water tables, while they are collapsing in India, and there's massive internal rife in India of 1 billion people, and they've got to mine it for us, why the hell are they mining for us when they've got massive collapse in their society? What should I tell the people in India that they've got to mine their minerals for us, which we're going to turn into a wind turbine, and then after 10 years, when it collapses, or a solar panel, we're going to dump it back in Africa?
Right,
I mean,
thank you very much.
I don't really understand the whole supply chain and how it's been completely overlooked. That who is it threatening if it's actually calculating at the point of extraction? Thank you.
Right, Duncan, I think that's probably your sort of topic.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to appear to have glossed over what you talked about, because I think if you were my presentation, I was dwelling on that completely. One of the slides I didn't show is an open cast copper mine full of people just saying, again, this is part of our supply chain. It's something that the industry's got to really consider. We've really got to understand the impact of the decisions we make. And I say to students and clients, the specification of materials is a political decision as much as anything else, a social political decision. And we can't ignore the fact that just because we have specified something for decades, that it's okay. We've really got, as architects and specifiers, we've got to understand the source of all the materials that constitute our buildings, including the wind turbines. I was retweeting last week an image of a pile of wind turbine blades going into landfill. So, that is not circular, obviously. And I think we've got to come up with different solutions that are inclusive.
But then why not tell the public that what it is for what it is, that it's got slavery?
I do.
It shouldn't, no, I'm not talking about you.
Oh, well, you're talking to me now.
Right, we've got another question
but
here.
This is important.
Can we bring the mic?
This is called the bloody, it should be called the bloody Green New Deal, right? And I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to everyone.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Got it.
Okay. Over here.
Thanks, Robin Nicholson from The Edge. I wanted to pick up on one of Lynn's elephants, because she didn't read it out, which was VAT. So I've got two questions. One is for Duncan, which is, what's the VAT situation? This is just a straight question, nothing loaded about it. In a reconstructed building, when you've dismantled something and reassembled it, that's one question. Second one is, would it not be a little bit easier to retrofit if it was equal VAT on, say, 5%, new build and retrofit?
Okay, I mean, I've been writing about the VAT situation for over a decade. We can't move forward with retrofit as we need to with VAT as it is at the moment. So that's my position. Yeah. And there's various organisations that got various VAT equalisation campaigns at the moment. If you deconstruct a building, so it's a kit of parts, and it's then new build, you're in the normal world of zero rate or zero rating, or depending on the nature of your company, you might have to pay VAT anyway. But if you deconstructed it so far that it's a kit of parts. But I mean, I'm not advocating that we've got to deconstruct lots of buildings. I completely agree with that we need to adapt what we've got and try not to knock anything down. But VAT is the biggest elephant in the room to move forward, because all the cities declaring they want to be net carbon zero. 2 more lines down from that is saying, and retrofit the existing place. Yeah. Now, you're going to do that with a surcharge of 20% in the UK?
Yeah. Right, John.
Uncorking VAT would help immensely, I think, for the broader market. But there's also another one. It's not just VAT, it's capital allowances. That's where the real kick comes. And with the current, or the remodelling of the capital allowance for structures and plant, it doesn't incentivise. If you use that mechanism to incentivise, you'll get a bigger return than you will do for your VAT, because that's where you make your investment appraisal. Further on down the line for the materials themselves, in terms of VAT, most definitely, if you strike at the heart of the main financial accounting function of capital allowance, and where you're actually going to be reclaiming back some of your money, effectively, that is where you can make a huge impact. And that's where, if they are listening out there, government, have a bit of a rethink, definitely.
Thank you very much. We've got a question here.
Hello, yes, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Tukumbo from E2 London. I started as a volunteer for climate change in 2008, and I'm pushing the agenda forward, ensuring that training providers use the CSR to do something. My question is, with regards to the ABC, which represents assets, buildings, and communities, do you think that many local authorities really understand the kind of assets they have and how to preserve the assets, which includes buildings? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, Emma, let's start with you on that one.
I think a lot of local authorities probably don't fully understand what assets they have. So certainly within Cambridge, we've started to think, right, we've declared a climate emergency. What does that actually mean? And what does that mean for some of the assets that we have, which are highly emitting assets? You know, some of our assets like leisure centres, for example, are very high carbon emitters, but they have a very strong kind of social value to them. So I think there is a lot of work now going on in the background from all of those local authorities who've declared emergencies, who are now starting to think, right, what does that now actually mean for how we run ourselves as organisations, the assets that we own? What are the areas that we can actually influence? Should we be getting rid of some of our assets or repurposing those assets? So lots of local authorities are working on route maps for how they get to net zero or circular economy and so forth. So I think that's something that's going to have to be looked at as part of that. And there could be some very difficult decisions that have to be made. And I'm quite glad I'm not making some of those decisions.
Thank you very much. Well, we are nearly up time. We've got a couple of questions. So let's just take a question over there.
Okay, thank you. My name is Abu. I'm a planning consultant with Robinson and Hall. This question is directed to Emma. As a planning consultant, I find it very difficult not to plan around the car, especially when providing houses in the countryside, where you find that access to public transport is very limited. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how we approach that issue. I can understand when we are planning for urban areas where public transport is very accessible.
Okay. I think that's where we actually need to start planning beyond local authority boundaries, and dare I say it, regional planning. I do think we need to start thinking about, certainly some examples that I've seen. One local authority that I came across, this was a few years ago, they were actually looking at increasing their carbon reduction requirements for rural developments to try and offset some of the emissions associated with car transport. So that's one way it's been looked at in the past. But I think we actually need to look bigger than that. And I suppose when cities are looking at, introducing congestion charging or so forth, is that something that, the money from congestion charging could then be used to improve public transport to surrounding communities and to more rural communities? So that will help with those options then that are currently subject to funding cuts. Could some of that money be put back into regenerating those routes? So I think that's when you need to start thinking about city regions and start thinking wider than just the urban area.
Thank you very much. Final question in the back there.
Hello, Sam Cooper, E2 Architecture. Carrot and stick question, I guess, planning really again, Emma, sorry. But we're talking about the incentives, tax incentives about demolition. Is there not a case that planning restrictions or policies could start to be introduced that require a justification for demolition? In conservation areas, we need to justify the demolition, but isn't what we're talking about here that we really need to ask ourselves the question at planning stage, does this deserve demolition?
I agree. I think that is a question that we should be asking. I know that some landowners, Cambridge University, for example, they're now starting to ask those questions of themselves, having declared their own climate emergency. So yeah, I think we are going to need to get to a stage where we are asking those questions. I don't think anyone's approached that yet, We're about to start some work on what does net zero carbon policy look like in local plans, and that could be one of the things that looks at, is what sort of evidence do you need to ask developers to submit to justify new build versus demolition. And we are starting to look at that on some kind of heritage assets. But yeah, I think that could be applied more widely.
Thanks. Anyone else want to have a go at that one, Duncan?
No, for the last 6 months, I've been working with Brighton Hove City Council because we're going to help them draft their circular economy route map, and we've been talking about that a lot. And we're actually going to start a live deconstruction project with them in the next couple of months. So a building that was allocated for demolition is going to be slowed down to deconstruction. And then they're going to put that material out into their sort of infrastructure, their supply chain. We're actually doing a summer school. In the meantime, you're going to use that material. But it's going to test their supply chain and their ability to start to cope with the storing of the material that would come off deconstruction sites. So that's going to inform their policy.
Thank you very much. Well, we are up to time. I'll just finish by saying when I started training as an architect, retrofit was something architects turned their nose up at, and only surveyors used to do it. And only last year I was asked by the Pritzker Prize jury to create a list of buildings they could look at in London. And I listed the Royal Opera House, Stanton Williams, the V&A by Amanda Levy, Royal Academy, David Chipperfield, Tate Britain by Caruso St John, Central St Martin's, also by Stanton and Williams. And it was only afterwards when I looked at the list I realised that they were all retrofit and additions to existing buildings without demolition and reconstruction. So it is now embodied into architectural thinking, which is a very good thing. And I'd like to thank our team on the platform very much for their contribution, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.